Scripture is not silent on money. It speaks about it more than it speaks about prayer, and one of the clearest patterns it lays out is a principle of balance that some call the rule of thirds: a third in land, a third in active enterprise, a third kept liquid and ready. This is not a modern invention dressed up in old language. It is drawn directly from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, echoed in the teaching of Jesus, and confirmed centuries later by secular investors who arrived at the same conclusion through entirely different reasoning. What follows is that principle, traced through the text itself. The starting point is Solomon, described in 1 Kings 10 verse 14 as receiving 666 talents of gold, in a single year, an almost unimaginable sum for the ancient world. But the chapters surrounding that verse do not describe a king who simply stored his wealth. They describe trade fleets, partnerships with Hiram of Tyre, commerce routes stretching into Arabia and beyond. Solomon's wealth was not a static pile. It was in motion, deployed across multiple ventures rather than concentrated in one. Scripture records the scale of what he had, then immediately shows how it was circulating, which is the first clue that biblical wisdom about money is not about accumulation for its own sake. Solomon makes the underlying principle explicit in Ecclesiastes 11 verse 2, "Give a portion to 7, and also to 8, for thou knowest not what evil shall be upon the earth." Read plainly, this is an instruction to divide resources rather than concentrate them, because the future is unknown and a single point of failure can undo everything built on top of it. The verse immediately before it, Ecclesiastes 11 verse 1, reinforces the same idea from a different angle: "Cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days." Bread cast upon water, grain shipped out on trade routes, was not a guaranteed return. It was probability, not certainty, which is exactly why the very next verse counsels spreading that risk across 7 or 8 portions rather than staking everything on one voyage. Scripture is describing diversification and staged risk centuries before the term existed. The rule of thirds specifically, land, business, and cash in hand, became formalized later in rabbinic commentary on these same texts, but its logic follows directly from what the wisdom books already teach. That wealth exists in different forms with different behaviors, and that no single form can be trusted to protect a household through every season. Land is described throughout the Old Testament as a durable inheritance, tied to promise and permanence. Think of the repeated instructions in the law about land reverting to families in the year of Jubilee, a system built around the idea that land ownership should never be permanently lost to a single bad season or decision. Business and trade appear throughout Proverbs as the domain of diligence and skill, most vividly in the description of the worthy woman in Proverbs 31, who considereth a field, and buyeth it, who perceiveth that her merchandise is good, and whose trading does not stop by night. And liquid reserves, grain stored, resources kept ready, appear as the difference between survival and ruin in the story of Joseph in Egypt, where 7 years of surplus were deliberately not consumed but reserved against 7 years of famine that no one else had prepared for. Scripture warns just as clearly against the failure to balance these forms of wealth as it commends the wisdom of holding them. Proverbs 21 verse 5 says, "The thoughts of the diligent tend only to plenteousness, but of every one that is hasty only to want." Haste here is not simply acting quickly, it is acting beyond what one's reserves can support, overcommitting into a single venture or form of holding faster than wisdom allows. The Proverbs writer treats this haste as the direct cause of poverty, not bad luck, but a structural failure of planning. On the opposite side, Proverbs 26 verse 13 rebukes the person who uses fear as an excuse for inaction. The slothful man saith, "There is a lion in the way, a lion is in the streets." This is the person who hoards out of fear, who keeps everything liquid and touches nothing else, using the excuse of danger to avoid ever putting resources to work. Scripture does not treat this as safety. It treats it as a form of foolishness equal to the recklessness of the overextended. Between these two failures, the haste that overcommits and the fear that hoards, sits the balance the text actually commends. Holding land, business, and liquidity together means no single failure destroys the household. A famine that ruins the harvest does not destroy a family that also has trade income and stored grain. A failed trade venture does not destroy a family that also holds land and reserves. A season of inflation or scarcity that erodes stored grain does not destroy a family whose land and enterprise are still producing. This is precisely the logic behind Joseph's counsel to Pharaoh in Genesis 41, where he does not tell Egypt to store everything or spend everything, but to set aside a portion during years of plenty specifically so the nation would not be undone when plenty ended. The parable of the talents in Matthew 25 sharpens this into a teaching about responsibility rather than mere strategy. A master distributes talents to 3 servants according to their ability, then departs. 2 of the servants put what they were given to work and double it. The third, given 1 talent, buries it in the ground out of fear, and when the master returns, that servant explains himself by saying, "I was afraid, and went and hid thy talent in the earth." The master's response is sharp. He calls the servant wicked and slothful, not because he lost money, but because he did nothing with what he was given. The parable does not condemn caution. It condemns paralysis dressed up as caution. The same failure Proverbs describes in the slothful man who sees a lion in the street and never leaves the house. Both texts point to the same conclusion: wealth held back entirely out of fear is not stewardship. It is a refusal of the responsibility that came with receiving it in the first place. This is the deeper theological claim underneath the whole principle. Scripture consistently frames wealth as something entrusted rather than something owned outright. Psalm 24. 1 states plainly, "The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein." If everything ultimately belongs to God, then a household's task is not simply to accumulate as much as possible, nor to protect what it has out of fear, but to manage it faithfully, which is exactly the word the parable of the talents uses. Managers who are faithful with a little are given more, managers who bury what they were given lose even what they had. The rule of thirds, understood this way, is not primarily a wealth-building technique. It is a discipline of faithful management that happens to produce resilience as a side effect. Proverbs 4 verse 7 introduces one clear exception to strict balance: wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting get understanding. The phrase carries weight. Get wisdom even if it costs everything you have, because unlike land, unlike a business, and unlike cash in hand, understanding and skill cannot be seized, cannot be devalued by inflation, and cannot be lost to a bad season. A household that spends heavily on education or the development of a skill in a child is not violating the balance permanently. It is investing in the one asset Scripture treats as more foundational than the other 3 combined, on the reasoning that a person equipped with wisdom and skill will rebuild balance faster than one who inherited money without either. Scripture also addresses what happens when balance is neglected across generations. Proverbs 13 verse 22 says, "A good man leaveth an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of the sinner is laid up for the just." The verse assumes wealth is meant to outlast the person who built it, which raises the question of why so many inheritances fail to survive even 2 or 3 generations. The pattern observed across many families, that fortunes tend to dissolve within a few generations of being built, is not itself a scriptural claim, but the reasoning behind it lines up with what Proverbs teaches elsewhere about wisdom versus inheritance. Money passed down without the understanding of how it was built and preserved tends not to last, because the recipients received the resource without receiving the discipline. A father teaching his children the actual pattern of balanced stewardship, not merely leaving them money, fulfills Proverbs 13 verse 22 in a fuller sense than simply passing on a sum. None of this is exclusively ancient. Benjamin Graham, writing in the 20th century with no explicit reference to these texts, arrived at what he called the margin of safety, the principle that an investor should never be so confident in a single position that being wrong about it becomes catastrophic. Graham assumed error as a starting condition and built portfolios that could absorb it. Charlie Munger, decades later, warned repeatedly against the unnecessary interruption of compounding caused by over-leveraging, and was known for holding meaningful cash reserves even during strong markets, on the reasoning that dislocations are inevitable and readiness matters more than maximum exposure at any given moment. Neither man was quoting scripture, but both were independently describing the same structural discipline that Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and the parable of the talents describe. Balance protects against both the haste that overcommits and the fear that hoards. Applying this practically begins with an honest accounting, in the spirit of the steward who must eventually give an answer for what was entrusted to him. List what you hold and sort it by kind. Land or property, active business or enterprise, and reserves that are genuinely accessible without loss. Many people, on doing this honestly, discover they are heavily concentrated in property and business with very little held in reserve, which means a single disruption, illness, a market downturn, a failed venture, could force them into exactly the kind of hasty, undervalued sale that Proverbs 21 verse 5 warns against. The correction described in the Joseph narrative is not sudden. Egypt did not liquidate its granaries overnight to fix an imbalance, it built reserves gradually, during years of plenty, specifically so they would be available when plenty ended. The same gradual correction applies to a household today. Rather than disrupting existing land or business holdings all at once, new resources can be directed toward liquidity until balance is restored. A second practical step follows from the pattern in Ecclesiastes 11. 2 of giving, a portion to 7, and also to 8, spreading commitments so they do not all come due, or all fail, at the same time. A business or investment portfolio structured so that different portions mature or become accessible in different years mirrors this staggered giving, ensuring that some capital is always returning to liquid form even while other capital remains at work. The opposite pattern, everything locked up on the same multi-year horizon, recreates exactly the single point of failure that the portion to 7, and also to 8, principle was meant to prevent. A third step draws on the same communal instinct behind the interest-free lending practices described in passages like Deuteronomy 15, where members of the community were expected to lend to one another in times of need without the crushing weight of interest. A small circle of trusted family or friends who agree to support one another briefly during emergencies or genuine opportunities reflects this same principle at a household scale, mutual reserves that let no single member be forced into a hasty, disadvantageous decision purely for lack of nearby support. Taken together, the pattern Scripture lays out is neither the anxious hoarding condemned in Proverbs 26 verse 13 nor the reckless overcommitment condemned in Proverbs 21 verse 5, but a third way. Land held for durability, enterprise pursued with diligence, and reserves kept ready, not as an end in themselves, but as evidence of a household managing what has been entrusted to it rather than either burying it out of fear or gambling it away out of overconfidence. The parable of the talents ends with the faithful servants being told, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant, enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." The measure was never the size of the return alone. It was whether what had been entrusted was put to faithful, balanced use.